Turns out he's a major cinephile. They don't watch enough movies! It's a very simple formula! And here we go. Well, loyal listener, what do we have on tap today? Some spooky slasher? Maybe one of those M for mature rated animated shows in Invincible or Castlevania? That new superhero show on Netflix? Well, no. All I can say is one word. Well, we'll call it a phrase. Excelsior, true believers. The time has finally come. I did not know when it was going to come, but this is the start of 4 back-to-back Marvel Cinematic Universe deep dives. The amazingness of Tony Stark, played to perfection by Robert Downey Jr., America's ass, and my first foray into non-X-Men superhero media, Captain America, and so many more. This 23-film franchise rivals almost everything I can conceivably think of, excluding maybe the James Bond franchise, which they will soon eclipse in the next year or so. And while we did have a bit of a pause on the Marvel movie scene, some Disney Plus shows were keeping our appetite at bay in WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and soon to come Loki. And the film franchise will be picking up in earnest soon, with no less than 4 films coming this year, including Eternals, Shang-Chi, the seemingly loaded Spider-Man No Way Home, and the fast approaching and inspiration for this list to happen ASAP, Black Widow to kick off July 9th. So time to go back to Phase 1 this week. Remember how much Iron Man grew into the godfather of the franchise before that final see if the Hulk movie stands the test of time. And remember how excited we were for that first massive team-up in the MCU before we could not believe how many Avengers were assembling in Endgame. All that and more, right now. Iron Man kicked it all off 2008, so cast lists for these, especially if you're a huge MCU fan like me, might feel repetitive. Yes, you know all about Robert Downey, Gwyneth Paltrow, and an acting role for Jon Favreau. This was the first and lone moment, however, of Empire's own Terrence Howard in War Machine. This was a first look at the star power they could get in these, getting Jeff Bridges to play, very well, the first big bad, when Paul Bettany was just a voice for multiple Marvel movies, before getting a body and co-starring in a 60s sitcom not so long ago. And of course, this was our first look at Clark Gregg's Agent Coulson, a lovable character whose, air quotes, end in Avengers first added some stakes to the franchise, where most heroes would never perish, and kick off a very up and down, mostly up, show, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. And of course, this was the first of many Stan Lee cameos. Yes, he was there for the non-MCU, but we'll keep this MCU for now. And this is a great movie to kick off with our first reference of the 10 Rings that will see more references in this hero's individual story, and hopefully the questions will be answered a bit in Shang-Chi. Like, is Trevor getting mad punished after Iron Man 3, and any throwaway reference to the fake Mandarin in Aldrich Killian? But to the movie itself, which I will preface, most of my Marvel knowledge comes from movies, TV, and Googling, just an FYI. Honestly, if you're watching this movie for the first time, you might wonder what you turned on, if something got mixed up along the way. This movie starts off as a war scene that verges from fun to surprisingly dark. But no matter what, it's easy to tell instantaneously that Robert Downey Jr. was perfectly cast in this. Like Hugh Jackman and Wolverine, these non-household names would quickly rise to prominence in and because of their superhero roles in Marvel projects. The real question is, can we get Hugh Jackman to the MCU? The world may never know, like the mystery of what could have been with the Snyderverse and the Ayer cut. All of that, I'm super hoping for at this point. As our story here begins, however, it starts about a third of the way in and then backtracks after that. But the playboy charismatic lifestyle is on display for our billionaire superhero playboy philanthropist. Compared to any version of Bruce Wayne we have ever seen, this takes the cake, which is wild to think about, but especially because we've had so many Batmans. While no one could have foreseen this 2008 superhero movie to rocket to the top and kick off a decade-spanning franchise, even as early as this movie, there were these little setup moments. While the Manhattan Project is not a direct event we've seen in the MCU, it subtly sets up those steps for World War II and the eventual reveal of that wartime period for some historical fiction with our first look at Chris Evans as Captain America. I know this is going to sound a little bit bashy of Batman and Wayne Manor, but that's my favorite super of all time. But I gotta calls it like I sees it. HGTV Nick, that's how I do. Nothing can match the Tony Stark house for opulence and true wealth. And if I had to live one of these two places, you gotta think I'd be living at the Stark house complex. That place looks bananas. And I mean, the showing of all that fun, it's probably reminiscent of me of the most fun Batman house wealthy scene where he just buys a hotel for the pool area from the Dark Knight. But this whole intro just shows how all about his wealth and yeah, you want to live that lifestyle. I know I do. And seeing his schmoozing abilities and selling anything and everything, he's the most charismatic lead you could ever have hoped for to kick off this grand scheme franchise. And while we don't get a ton of time with his friend in captivity in Jensen, his semi-mentor, not in tech, but in being a decent human being, Tony is still likable. Obviously, his time with Jensen and his death adds some much-needed purpose and direction for our superhero lead. His weapon merchant time, and now calling, he has this someone's telling him, there's this little wisp in the wind to help the world with his intellect. It is the start to a great journey that spans 10 movies, and his effects and character presence is always felt deeply, even when he's MIA, dead, however you want to put it, in that latest Spider-Man flick. And that moment of sadness gives way to an awesome action sequence and his first Iron Man suit. The suit-up scenes are always going to be fantastic. They always look better and better and better, and they're always cool. And while this is no Mortal Kombat level gore, we just talked about it, check out the episode if you haven't yet, the action fight set piece moments here are still exciting as all get up. And while these movies will always be known for their quirky one-liners, especially as they move away from this first entry in 2008, they grow up from here. There are some darker and intense moments, not just in the franchise overall, but a lot of them are in this first movie. It may not be DCEU dark, which once again I'm all about. The balance they find here works overall. And they give it to all of their Marvel movies. You know, they give them their own little flavor. I like Marvel movies, I like DCEU movies. They're just different, but they work in their own special ways, unless the ones where they try to go too much into each other, or sometimes they just try things that don't really work. And we'll get to those. We'll get there. And while we don't always see our heroes kill in Marvel, it's not as violent. They like to draw the line at fighting characters and not murdering them. There's more of that here than any movie I remember. Sure, there's an apocalyptic event that kills a ton of people. There's one in the Sokovia thing. There's the New York thing. There's the snap, obviously, although the snap is temporary, so chalk it up to what you want to do. But in this movie, Iron Man straight up kills all the terrorists that he can find. Is it a bad thing? No. But how many people say the animated Clone Wars show is just for kids? There's some intense moments in the larger MCU, and for sure in the Clone Wars show, which hopefully you're watching The Bad Batch on Disney Plus right now. And those threads and have those intense moments that are existing in the MCU, as much as people like to think about the quirky one-liners and snappy comebacks and retorts. Those darker threads are all around the MCU, but clearly they started here. Looking back, and at this point, most of the MCU movies you watch have to be looking back. Not many people have gone all this time avoiding the MCU and storylines and spoilers unintentionally. There are a few continuity errors. Most of these get fixed or addressed. Some are really fun lore adds. But the one that will never be sorted out is our first introduction to S.H.I.E.L.D., before they had the shorthand snappy name. In 2008, there's a clear plot joke about this not existing. But in Captain Marvel, which takes place in 95, they have the name figured out on hats. It's a little moment, but I had to point it out as a small error to continuity. Any time that they find some real-world ties as part of the Marvel world, it all feels more like it's fleshed out and exists and not this mythical alternate universe far, far away. I like it, and the moment in question is Jim Cramer kicks off these real-world cameos. And this would lead to the inclusions of Bill Maher, Method Man, and Stephen A. Smith to have some small presence in the MCU. Yes, a lot of those moments happen in Luke Cage, which is MCU. Netflix are sort of that, does it matter, does it count anymore? Doesn't matter to me, it does count, and Luke Cage is an awesome show, and Marvel should 100% bring back that group of Defenders. Allegedly, they're bringing back Charlie Cox's Daredevil in that Spider-Man movie, so feels like they can bring everyone back, including the Jon Bernthal Punisher, which really needs to come back. It may not always seem that Gwyneth Paltrow gets her time to shine in this franchise, but two things. One, she normally fixes the villain problem in every single movie. Two, she's just awesome in this world. She may not have to do most of the fighting in these movies. Some of them she does. But her interactions with Downey Jr. will always be the best as someone who can verbally go toe-to-toe with him. And their eventual romance that blooms. It's one of the best slow burns you could hope for. To get a little love with your flying around fisticuffs movies. This movie also reminds everyone how badly we all wanted a British AI in our personal lives. And monitors that were holographic displays that you could maneuver and contort to your lifestyle. And that Tony Stark lifestyle was something everyone wanted to be and everyone wanted to have. It's so cool. And while he kind of goes back to his fun Playboy antics a little bit in this movie, he takes a deep dive down that in the second film. You can kind of see his growth and those moments of being reminded that he has a duty to save the world from his company's weapons. And like when we see this big fancy Iron Man Mark II suit in an active war zone, it's our first superhero MCU landing. The action scene, there's just so many good things that happen here. And, saving these people and taking a stand to combat the evil of this world, where he's a little responsible for it. It's some over-the-top antics, and yeah, the combat doesn't last forever. It's brief, but it's fun to watch. And just seeing a really good superhero action scene coming in a time where Ghost Rider, Daredevil, and the goofier movies were how people saw this genre and medium, excluding Batman Begins. And this was a welcome change to see a high-profile, high-quality superhero movie. While our villain in the first of these MCU movies is not some masked flying demigod or superpower Nazi, the idea of business baddie betrayal in Iron Man, it's a nice twist, and Jeff Bridges plays that role well, balancing himself as a business guy who's putting up with Stark shenanigans and shows his true colors of a calculating criminal charlatan. The sinister moments are actually my favorite. The fight is good enough, but those moments before the Iron Man versus the Ironmonger are the best in this superhero movie that shaped the franchise for years to come. And it is in these moments that we also get our best Gwyneth Paltrow S.H.I.E.L.D. moments. While Obadiah Stane may not be a physically sinister 7-foot baddie, and there's some crazy scary MCU villains, he will always feel as menacing as any, with, you gotta give credit to Jeff Bridges playing that role. He's throwing Pepper Potts into a accidental stylish spy subterfuge situation, and getting a brief government spy action moment taking on this baddie before the big confrontation. It's a fun sprint to the end. And we also get that great quote yelling about, "Tony Stark built this in a cave with a box of scraps." And of course, one of the scarier parts in the film of Obadiah Stane taking Tony's heart power source Kali Ma style, leaving him for dead with a sinister villain monologue. It may be a brief afterthought, but there is some true pain of Terrence Howard saying next time, looking at an Iron Man suit, and as a viewer knowing that for him, the next time will never come to be. So our final fight has some good robot-on-robot action, and yes, the callback to the icing problem Tony needed to fix earlier in the movie. It's a nice circle story moment. And while killing villains early on was a problem for Marvel, instead of having that time to develop them over movies, and Jeff Bridges coming back would have been sweet, the highlight of this movie actually comes at the very end. While not a set-piece action moment, the best possible thing we could have gotten. This immediate loss of a secret identity and the mic drop moment of cool, collected confidence. The way we will end up talking about this amazing, hopefully still appreciated and adored when thinking of other MCU powerhouse Avengers movie. The I Am Iron Man still should give you chills how it ends that movie. But fake out, let's not forget, besides kicking off the MCU, this also was the start of the post-credit scene questions. Will it or won't it exist? How long do I gotta sit in this theater? How many of these things are there? Is it a mid-credit? Right at the end of the credits? I gotta know. Not only does this scene in question give us some semblance of a larger Avengers setup, but we get Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury in all his glory, even if it's literally for a hot second. The tease is a hope to set up a franchise. Many movies and shows have made that same hopeful tease to a long franchise. This one, however, actually clearly panned out for the better. So the next movie in the 2008 Incredible Hulk is a bit quirky. The character of the Hulk is a staple of the MCU. His Avengers movie role is crucial, but the solo movie total for him clocks in at about 1.5, that 0.5 obviously being Ragnarok. While his early second outing exists, the reason it feels the most out of place, it is not owned by Disney, even though it has further reached MCU ties in modern times, and while it tries to be isolated, it's impossible now. But it is the only one of these movies not on Disney+. The Spider-Man movies, not on there yet. Their Tom Holland half-Sony movies will soon find their way onto that Disney platform. The Universal Hulk movie seemingly continues to be less likely so. Maybe She-Hulk will change that. I'm going to bring up that show a lot. This movie is also wildly not available to view without paying to individually watch it. No streaming service has it, sadly. Which means less people are likely going to watch it now if they haven't seen it yet. Especially coming so early in the MCU days. This is crazy to think. Yes, I constantly make fun of the Ang Lee version. One of the two main punching bag movies on the reg for this podcast, including the Rob Zombie Friday the 13th films. All rubbish. This movie is a massive upgrade to the Ang Lee Hulk. The other big issue people have with this movie, lead actor is not Ruffalo, who everyone is accustomed to at this point. We got Ed Norton, who just announced recently enough he will be in the Knives Out sequel. Now, Ruffalo does an awesome job in the role, no question about that. But I think Edward Norton gets a bad rep, or is unceremoniously written off for his version of the character. This may not be the best movie, but it is in no way a bad movie. And look, I like Ed Norton. He's great in a ton of movies I like. Death to Smoochie, Red Dragon, and of course, The Italian Job. This movie also features Arwen from Lord of the Rings and Liv Tyler, who is never seen again in the MCU. Tim Blake Nelson as the eventual villain, the leader who is teased but never seen again. Tim Roth, who overall I love as the Abomination. And like I said in the Falcon episode, it's a precursor, his arc, to the eventual downfall of John Walker. Although they somehow let him get away with semi-scot-free his murders and things. I like Falcon the Winter Soldier. That will always give me a bit of a pause until we see more of John Walker's character. The one actor which helps bring this movie canon is William Hunt as General Ross, a character that has popped up in the last few Avengers movies, his big Civil War role, and he'll be back for the new Black Widow movie. So no matter what you think, yes, it can't be streamed on Disney+. This movie is part of the MCU and should be treated with the respect it deserves. Yes, it is probably better than Thor Dark World. Come back for part 2 of this episodic journey to see if I've changed my mind on that. Also, last point, like always, I recommend watching these in chronological order. For my podcast episodes, it's easier to do them in phases or when they came out, but watch them in chronological order. It just helps with the overall story. But to the movie at hand, the early on intro credit roll finds a way to give us our introduction to Hulk, some main conflicts, and more. The use of credits to quickly, but in a strong way, set up our story. With so many superhero movies being done time and time again, we don't need to always see Ben Parker or Thomas and Martha Wayne die. We get it. Great power, great responsibility, all that stuff. This movie takes a strong, and I think well thought out, successful way to kick everything off. We got Bruce chilling in Brazil. You know, that one breathing scene does with the stomach, always going to weird me out. Weird stomach things. I get it. The whole thing is making a living somewhere, trying to control his anger and not let the Hulk out. Sure, his talents may be underutilized in a bottling plant, but he keeps to himself and off the government radar. And there's something fun about a brief joke at the whole "you wouldn't like me when I'm angry" line with a failure to translate to hungry. And while it may not be AC/DC music, I really do like this orchestral soundtrack from Craig Armstrong that has the same tension you'd expect from a movie like this, where the whole theme is all about tension. I like a little bit of that mixed in with some trauma in my superhero movies. The more of it in the MCU, the better. And yes, I may be a bit biased with my appreciation for this movie, and that has probably something to do with Tim Roth being in this movie and Emil Blonsky. Look, the actor is great in Reservoir Dogs, The Hateful Eight, Pulp Fiction, and I can't wait to see him be the second brought back character from this movie into the larger MCU. You know, these ads of having these forgotten about characters in Disney Plus shows, it re-legitimizes this movie and its place in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I really do hope She-Hulk is good. I hope we get to see his character interact with Bruce Banner in the Disney Plus show. And I really hope they have a human face-to-face and not just the green monsters fighting each other part 2. Also, having Tim Roth trank a dog and have Ed Norton leave that dog, no good. Call John Wick, the Avenger of all dogs, immediately. Hopefully, he will be the latest star to join the MCU, with rumors of him taking on the Kraven role. Hopefully that's more MCU and less Venomverse. We'll see what comes of it. While the stakes in this movie may be a bit lower and more self-contained, the constant battle of a heart rate monitor and constant government pursuit, this movie for sure captures the tension and personal stakes more than many MCU movies, which is part of the DNA of it. I like this battle and having the Hulk fighting himself and not just a Rampage Palooza. There's enough of those movies out there. There literally is a movie called Rampage with The Rock, based on a video game all about breaking things. In our first look at him, while more his destruction, the movie decides to shield us for as long as they can, seeing the Hulk take down a Spec Ops unit. It's some awesome action and the military adversary against Tim Roth's character. It's a bit more fun for it, not just having two green men fight each other immediately on. And like I said, this whole thing is a precursor to the rise and fall of John Walker's character. It's a very similar arc. It just, the conflict looks great here too. And this is just the first of many fights with Blonsky and Banner. Even in this movie, they dance around it. But just mentioning super soldiers, the more Captain America references, the better, as far as I'm concerned. Heck, they have a super subtle nod in one of the Stark Industries vials they snag. It has the alias for Dr. Erskine, a.k.a. Stanley Tucci Gang. It actually had a deleted scene that was referencing even more Captain America Avengers things. And in actually the Avengers movie, they reference Banner trying to kill himself and Hulk canceling that out. Which, the scene doesn't exactly show that, but there's a moment where it was close enough to that. And it's awesome. In that moment, there's a brief, all this ice is breaking away, and you can see a glimmer of Captain America's shield in the ice. Which is a nice lead tease for that movie. Even better still, finding a way, any way, to include Lou Ferrigno, the Hulk many remember, is just an amazing touch to the history of the character, which this movie lovingly weaves into its fabric. If there's one part of this movie I feel not amazing about, is they really don't do a ton with Liv Tyler's character. She's super helpless damsel in distress who doesn't get the chance to do a ton. And with her character never being mentioned again, especially with her dad being around and the Hulk still existing, those characters haven't seen each other either. It all leads to a brief one-off that doesn't matter after all this. There is some rumor at least to the notion that she will also be around in She-Hulk. I want and need connected storylines to all of this, and somehow having everyone in this show to set up the leader in the movie debut as She-Hulk, those are things I'm speculating, but that's all I could hope for. Even if Ed Norton is clearly done the role, they gotta include everyone else they can, right? Whose MCU storyline do you want to see continued? For me, obviously, it has to be Gabriel Luna's Ghost Rider, of course, and I'm sure for you too. But if there's another one, let me know on social. One of the highlight moments for me in this movie, probably the highlight moment, is not the final conflict between the Hulk and Abomination in NYC. It's actually the fight before that on the college campus between the Hulk and a somewhat souped-up Blonsky, beside the university setting being a fun battleground romp. And first, fighting the military is a fun, chaotic way for an individual super soldier doing flips and seemingly holding his own before getting almost obliterated and drop-kicked into a tree. This is one of those movies where they clearly want you to root for the Hulk, but you totally get to some degree the government wants, even though the dissection parts may not make you want to root for them either. The other big issue I have here, right at the end, and I kind of mentioned it already, that while not announced, just like the Dylan Baker tease lizard in the Sam Raimi Spider-Verse, the Tim Blake Nelson leader is something I'd love to see, the intellect versus brawn conflict of the Hulk versus leader, who was just barely constructed at the end of this movie. Man, what could have been. Both their characters were awesome, and while the Amazing Spider-Man brought in a lizard, I will always wish for a Spider-Man 4 from Raimi to close things out. If they can close out, or not leave the MCU characters from Hulk out to dry as well, I would be ecstatic. The end is probably where this movie loses people a bit. It becomes a bit basic of its monster-on-monster fight in a big city. The trope is always the opposite of the hero is the villain. And I get it, this happens a lot. There's a reason it's a trope. It can be done to varying degrees of success. And while the CGI is not terrible, for sure, sometimes the best fights need some real people all up in it. At times you could say this is the case for Ironmonger, Whiplash, Red Skull, and more MCU baddies. Hence why the leader conflict could have been so fun. Finding a way to give more depth to Abomination will be great when we see that character return in She-Hulk. And I liked his original human character in the same way that, Wonder Woman took an odd turn with a big god CGI fight in the end, where the depth was so amazing and deep through the other old-timey superhero in a war scene elements to that film. While the future could be brighter for these secondary characters, and by no stretch is this a bad movie, it just gets a bit generic in the end. That is until we get another amazing post-credit scene that harkens back to the Suicide Squad with Bruce Wayne meeting Amanda Waller. Having Tony have a verbal standoff with General Ross is an amazing fun time, and partly why it's so much fun to see them interact later on in Civil War and beyond. Speaking of Tony Stark, time to tackle the next Iron Man movie. Iron Man 2 from 2010 is one of those movies that you remember being better, and somehow it just doesn't stand up, especially when compared to other MCU entries. Everything's going to feel like it pales in comparison to Infinity War and Endgame. I get it. And there are some great things about this movie. There are some things that are not great here. Mickey Rourke is just okay as the physical threat villain of Whiplash. While the movie doubles down on baddies, having an average villain just isn't going to help your movie stand out. I may not be super familiar with his works. I remember his brief cameo in The Expendables, but that's about it. This movie does lean even more into the celebrity status of its titular lead in the now open and exposed Iron Man as Tony Stark. And honestly, this is still as fun as before, hanging with the real larger-than-life celebrity superhero. Not a ton of characters have that idea going for them. And a superhero who has money using it all to bring attention to his Stark Event Expo, I'm all about this setting and how the movie plays around with it. Jumping out of an airplane in his suit and landing to some AC/DC, which is the whole soundtrack for this movie, in a venue of adoring fans and Iron Man cheerleaders. The whole thing is just cool and different from anything else out there in the MCU. And there's something fun to be said about this huge nerd being super cool. Nice representation and wish fulfillment. This movie also gives us one of the two representations of Tony's dad. Both are great. First, seen by Mad Men's John Slattery, who will always feel right at home in a period piece since his amazing stint in Mad Men. I like the Dominic Cooper version too, from Captain America and Agent Carter. Heck, I just saw him again in the better than you think it would be Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter movie on HBO Max. Slattery gets a bit more love in the role and in the MCU as a whole. I wish we'd gotten more Dominic Cooper and Haley Atwell in Agent Carter Season 3, or just in general, maybe a Howlin' Commandos movie. TBD. The challenge that this new movie puts on Tony Stark is his celebrity status. Well, it's a little one-sided, but Justin Hammer, a rival tech CEO, played to perfection by Sam Rockwell. He may not always be a household name, but when he shines super brightly. His Jojo Rabbit performance was hilarious and heartbreaking all at once. And his character is a good over-the-top business rival who just will never have the same it factor as Tony does. Like we said in our Falcon the Winter Soldier episode, his dance scene in this movie is still a top 2 dance scene in the entire MCU. This is also our first look at the new actor playing James Rhodes. Now the role falls to Don Cheadle. While I will always be curious what could have been with Terrence Howard, Cheadle does a lovely job in the role, as we've come to expect. I will say I'm still a bit nervous for the Space Jam sequel, what his villainous role will look like compared to the OG Monstars. But when we have this moment, this conflict of everyone trying to get his suit, the government's all after it. Like, this scene continues to show how Tony's, it's his world and everyone else is just kind of living in it. They're all peasants, and his charisma is and always will be a staple of Marvel. And in that same scene, the late Gary Shandling has a small role as a government person trying to get his stuff. And having his character peek up later in Captain America Winter Soldier and the whole Hydra twist they have going on, it's just one of those many moments. They do the same thing with Jasper Sitwell, of characters appearing a couple movies or even a decade later and still having that world exist. They just have so many ways to bring in characters and these little references to each other that really makes this movie franchise just feel so interconnected that you have to watch everything and you don't feel annoyed that you have to watch everything. Oh, maybe Thor Dark World. This movie also sets up a ton of ties to the larger MCU. Things like S.H.I.E.L.D. were only briefly mentioned and seen in the first Iron Man and Incredible Hulk. They are at full force here. The introduction of Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow, she has some iconic moments in fight choreography in this movie. More time to play with a huge connective tissue of the MCU. We got Phil Coulson coming back, and some actual time with Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson. I get that S.H.I.E.L.D.'s importance to the MCU of recent has taken a huge hit, but in Phase 1 and 2, the S.H.I.E.L.D. agency for me, I was a huge fan of that. This movie at times, they bounce around a lot, kind of like a globe-trotting James Bond fun film movie time. And the wealth of Tony Stark, it fits into that mold. He's hanging out in Monaco, racing his own company car. He's chatting with all these bigwigs. Of course, when he does all this stuff, why not? And this movie is all the better with Sam Rockwell trying to keep up. I mean, his character is a huge reason I like this movie more than most. And while this movie always kind of feels more jokey in the same way, I think that a lot of people look at Iron Man 3 the same way. There's actually some deeper themes of, he's a dead man walking with chest injuries and the interesting angle of legacies and his strained relationship with his dad. Like, those are some deep moments and themes that this movie tries to explore. It's funny that all my memorable moments of this movie kind of come from Sam Rockwell's character, but beside that dancing, the most memorable part of this, when I first watched it, was that hope to one day be rich enough to fly in specialty ice creams. That's the real dream we're all hoping for. And Justin Hammer lives that dream for parts of this movie, at least. And other parts of this movie, I'm not super about. One of those moments, the super awkward another one bites of dust Iron Man suit fight. It gets the story where it has to be, and it brings in Samuel L. Jackson, but overall, this scene is the cringiest of the whole MCU. Once again, have to double check Thor Dark World. But that might just be kind of bland and bad. This scene is like stupid bad. While Samuel L. Jackson is always going to be amazing in just about every movie he's in, from Pulp Fiction to the Star Wars prequels and even the bad movies he's in, he's still amazing. And like the majority of MCU casting, this is another one that they just nailed. And his 11 movie roles, from small to Avengers role sized, they're all fantastic. And latest we've heard is his Secret Invasion show. No one really knows how big or how small this thing is going to be. Could have been a movie, they want to make it a show. All fine. Who knows what cameos we'll get, if it's what we hope it will be. Like, this is his first Disney plus Marvel starring show. Thankfully, we'll continue to get more character development from this lovely combination of Marvel TV. Look, I would love if we can get a Mace Windu Disney plus show in there too. Awesome. I don't think we're going to, but if we want to, I wouldn't hate it. Your move, Star Wars. This has pretty much become a Sam Rockwell puff piece. But, I mean, every time he's on camera, I'm all about it. I could listen to him schmooze and describe things all day. His weird, quirky descriptions of the weapons to our War Machine. Mwah, chef's kiss. He makes this movie work. Without him, this movie could be 4 out of 10, 3 out of 10. He brings it up significantly. While the big robot fight, it doesn't do it for me. That conflict is just sort of okay. The overall internal conflict and struggle Tony deals with in this movie, and the eventual moment of reconnection to his dead father, those deep moments are what this movie is at its best. It shines. And this leads to him doing some real smart guy science. And those are always the coolest parts of this character. The suit-up moments are neat, but the hologram interpretation parts will always be visually stunning. It's why I like my car, Siri, and Google Maps to all be British after all these years. If you have not yet seen it, please treat yourself this weekend to see the Sam Rockwell Iron Man 2 dance. I really got to come up with that, somehow, that dance on TikTok. Got to bring the TikTok back. Views are dropping a little bit of late. While robot drone fighting, like I said, kind of bland, I will actually end this moment with probably the most exciting fight in the movie. Watching Black Widow do less spy work and see some real combat action will also be one of the few moments that we will remember when looking back on this movie. And just in time for her way overdue solo outing. We get a brief bit of that in Thor with the Hawkeye character. We almost had, believe it or not, a Captain America Hawkeye fight in the Winter Soldier. Something sadly missing. Hopefully he will have some part to play in the Black Widow movie. Maybe this mysterious Budapest storyline will be seen. And of course, his Disney Plus TV show with his daughter will be coming to Disney Plus in late 2021. Lots to look forward to from Marvel and Disney Plus shows. I know I've pretty much stopped talking about this movie overall, but the retcon of the kid in the helmet being a young Peter Parker, having a start up to the moment of his hero, who he'd eventually work with and have a huge bond with throughout Phase 3. Beautiful ad that just works. My last point to this up and down movie, the Marvel one-shot All Hail the King, was the last Justin Hammer scene moment. Like Tim Roth's Abomination and She-Hulk, there's also talk about bringing Sam Rockwell back in the role for the Armor Wars show. I'm sure you guys think I'm making these up. These are all real things that are happening. Starring Don Cheadle. And he had a brief cameo role in The Falcon Winter Soldier. They got to give everyone a connective tie back into the larger MCU with these outstanding, hopefully that track record continues with Loki, Marvel Disney Plus TV shows. Speaking of Loki, that character was introduced in the 2011 film Thor, and that's where things took a step away from sci-fi and war stories and went to a more mythical land, Asgard to be exact. And while it goes to blend magic and technology, this is the true definition of entering a larger world, and this was the first steps to things like Guardians of the Galaxy and Doctor Strange. This movie has a ton of actors to keep track of and tries to do a ton of mythology and world building in a very short time. Not saying that's good or bad, but that is a fact. The cast is packed with A-listers, looking at it now. Back in 2011, Chris Hemsworth and Tom Hiddleston were unknown quantities. But in 2021, throw them in there with Hannibal legend Anthony Hopkins, Natalie Portman coming off her Black Swan performance, and if you look a little bit down the cast list, you'll get Idris Elba snuck in there, who is amazing in all of his movies. The more of him, the better. This movie also did some shield building with a brief introduction to Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye, and even more Agent Coulson's Clark Gregg. While this movie franchise never really knew what to do with the Warriors 3 and Lady Sif, personally, I love Josh Dallas in the role. Even more Once Upon a Time legacy on this podcast. Ray Stevenson, who, while his previous Marvel take on The Punisher was not my favorite, his sympathetic hitman vigilante on Dexter was one of my favorites of a show that has had its ups and downs. And we see Tonobu Asano, who you all recently enough saw in the brand new Mortal Kombat Mortal Kombat movie. While this movie introduces a ton, some of these actors, like Lady Sif's Jamie Alexander and Portman's character, have been put on the back burner for a bit in the MCU. But both are coming back in full force in Thor: Love and Thunder in 2022. To the movie, I will make a slight observation. Look at Thor in this 2011 movie, and look at him in Ragnarok. Chris Hemsworth has aged tremendously in that time, at least in his face, where he looks crazy young back in 2011. But he was in his 20s after all. Not everyone can be ageless like Paul Rudd. Just based specifically on WandaVision, this movie did introduce us to Kat Dennings' Darcy Lewis, who had a cult following, just like Randall Park's Jimmy Woo after Ant-Man and the Wasp. So while my love for high fantasy may not have been divulged too deeply on this podcast, I love it. You're in for a treat when I finally talk about the Lord of the Rings extended cut episodes in plural. So I'm all about magic and sword fighting and all that history being thrown at us to start Thor. And Asgard overall looks incredible. Patrick Doyle has composed a soundtrack that is epic and beautiful, fitting for this theme and setting. It was a unique spin to make it a bit more techy and not make Rainbow Bridges so aggressively magical to start. Marvel had to work their way up for their audiences to have magic like Scarlet Witch, thankfully titled as such now, and Doctor Strange. While childish, bratty Thor is something none of us are about, especially with how charming he has grown over the years, and that growth is actually based on his time with the humans and Natalie Portman, which is a nice character arc. There's no doubt one of the best parts of this movie comes from the ill-fated attempt to storm the home of the Frost Giants. The fight looks awesome, the action is frantic, and it feels less like a superhero thing, and the MCU kind of started branching out into these other subgenres. And of course, this moment gives us a fun tease into the true parentage of Loki, unbeknownst to him. While from this point on, the story is a fun enough romp through humanity and Thor learning to be less terrible and arrogant, there's something hilarious about a ton of people making a cookout and trying to lift Thor's hammer. And of course, this leads to the amazing moment of smashing his glass on the ground, screaming for another drink. Who doesn't want to do that in the bar? But hopefully we've all learned to not be terrible people doing that. While Thor is a half mythical movie, half on Earth movie, this movie should be credited with giving us the best movie villain, especially for the time, in Tom Hiddleston's performance as Loki. To this day, still one of the best MCU ever had to offer. While we get more S.H.I.E.L.D. thrown into the entire fiber of this movie, more than previously in the other 3 or 4, once again, the first big boss fight in this movie, it isn't it for me. But seeing mortal Thor fight a wave of S.H.I.E.L.D. agents, while it's a huge letdown for Hawkeye doing things, those people fights will always look better than large CGI bosses, which is why we need to continue the Air Cut and Snyderverse. Please, HBO Max, Warner Brothers, and everyone else, hear our calling. And while that fight with the big bad robot in the city is just okay, and somehow the Frost Giants are quickly relegated to the back burner, the character drama between Thor and Loki and their eventual conflict of the Bifrost with all of his Loki treachery, using it to try to break through all these bad worlds. And you can see Thor's growth here. It's clear and present and nice to want to save those realms that he previously would have gone to war with, all while eventually losing his brother with a pretty fun fight with a lot of the magic disappearing stuff. And he has to sacrifice not only his brother, who seemingly dies, he loses the Bifrost, so he never can come to Earth, seemingly. And that's some emotional stakes, and this movie, of course, leads into our Avengers conflict. And while I would never watch it this way, the next on tap for us takes us to the first chronological MCU movie to date, Captain America: The First Avenger, coming out in 2011. I was super excited to rewatch another historical fiction piece. Captain America: The First Avenger was the first to do it in World War II, followed up by a super strong Wonder Woman, also a World War-based movie, that time in World War I for DC. This one brings in the best musical number in the MCU, and having some amazing actors to boot. Lord of the Rings and Matrix vet Hugo Weaving. Unfortunately, he's not in the fourth Matrix film coming out for some crazy reason. Haley Atwell, who needs to continue the story of Agent Carter, although allegedly she'll be back somehow in Captain America 4, gotta be a flashback for obvious reasons. Tommy Lee Jones, who excels in war movies. The list is endless here, with Dominic Cooper, who crushed it in another historical fiction piece in Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter. Richard Armitage, who you should absolutely watch in the final Castlevania season on Netflix. And back to Dominic Cooper for a hot sec, he absolutely should have gotten more time to play in the role of Howard Stark. I might bring this up a lot, but I'll bring it up again as much as I want to. Of course, Stanley Tucci, bringing the Tucci gang to the MCU. Lastly, Neil McDonough, who was great in the Arrowverse, and his mustachioed role here is strong but brief, and even he got a moment to shine in Agent Carter. Of course, our leads are BFFs Chris Evans and Sebastian Stan, and honestly, their bromance throughout the MCU started to blossom the moment they are both on camera together here. You can probably tell, this time period and overall this movie is easily one of my favorites from the whole MCU. Look, Nazis will always be a great movie, video game, or any type of villain. Sometimes they do a bit more overall with them, like in Jojo Rabbit, but it worked for 2/3 of the Indiana Jones movies, and it works here. Like Agent Carter before, the time period plays so well with Marvel. The oldies timeline, spies, and subterfuge. All of it. While we should have gotten more than 2 seasons and 1 movie with it. I always wonder what could have been. I also think I really like the budding chemistry Chris Evans has with seemingly everyone. His kind of joke rivalry with Sebastian Stan and Dominic Cooper. His romance blossoming with Haley Atwell. And of course, the mentorship and warmness of Stanley Tucci. His role in this world and movie may be brief, but he's so charming and full of wisdom. You can't help but smile with him on camera. I mean, just overall, this movie makes you smile. And you have to root for Skinny Steve. The whole war training montage of using his brain and putting others first all comes second nature. And it never comes off as like vintage Superman as the boring Boy Scout. Obviously, that impression has changed for that character through media and comic representation. But this movie finds a way to make Steve righteous and still super likable and rootable. It doesn't feel obnoxious in that way. And when the big transformation finally does come, and we get to see oldies NYC in all its glory, the chemistry between Chris Evans and Haley Atwell continues to grow. And honestly, these action set pieces are just better in this movie than many before. Sure, no one's flying around or shooting magic beams or lasers, but there is so much good here. Swimming down a submarine and helping everyone he can. I love so many parts of this movie. While they don't want to throw Nazis all over this movie, I mean, it seems impossible at the time, but they do a pretty good job of quickly taking the Nazi branding out of it and making the war more so the Red Skull's battle of his own enemies and ruling the world himself. And while the fighting is great, the best part of this movie will always be the musical stylings of The Star-Spangled Man, a song that rocked the waves with its modern-day band version in The Falcon and The Winter Soldier. But the dance choreography, the song that slaps, the old-timey movie parts of an actor acting, and of course, the multiple Hitler knockouts. It's the most fun part of the movie. And the clear, hard point cut of actually throwing him into a war zone, where he is thrown to the wolves, and you can see his pain being America's mascot. And this is always now going to be in counterpoint to John Walker's take into being Captain America for a time. Like Wonder Woman taking the front, seeing Steve save a group of soldiers with his BFF included, those hard jumps to designated war hero. It's crazy how much I love this movie years after it came out. Like I said, This was the introduction of the MCU for me, and how I've come to be obsessed with all of their rich catalog of films and now TV shows. Weirdly, this is also how I feel about the early Magneto moments in the X-Men version of Marvel before the MCU's existence. His character arc and motivations will always be the best for me, tied so deeply to a traumatic upbringing and a period piece war. Those flashbacks from the first X-Men and eventually X-Men Origins are part of the reason I will always be on his side in most every media adaptation. I can't wait to see what he will look like and act like in the larger MCU, and of course, hopefully, explore that relationship with Wanda Maximoff, who is his daughter, in case you didn't know. I'm waiting for those MCU mutants to be introduced. And if it's not Ian McKellen or Fassbender, it probably won't be Ian McKellen. I gotta imagine it won't be Fassbender. If it's not either of them, I will always appreciate those portrayals of the role. And speaking of portrayals, the special effects and makeup that went into making the Red Skull, it looks, dare I say, beautiful. And for sure it still holds up. And this villain may be a super soldier, but it doesn't ever feel like it's the same as another shield-throwing clone. It's a darker version, sure, but there are just some differences that exist to give it enough separation to feel like a good villainous pairing and a good rival. I also think people forget that Natalie Dormer exists in this movie, one of my favorites from Tudors and Game of Thrones. Yeah, she's barely part of the MCU, but seeing my celebrity crush in anything. Yes, please. If you're listening, by any chance, hi, Natalie Dormer. I'm single, so yeah. But anyway, time for something super different. Back to the movies. While Sebastian Stan might be part of the MCU as a whole now, when people first watched this movie, if you didn't read the comics or know where the character was going to go, he was constantly getting the Ethan Winters treatment for your recent Resident Evil Village players. Ethan is thankfully not too attached to his hand, because that game is constantly taking them away from him. But this movie first abducts Bucky, gets experimented a little bit on, then he seems fine, seemingly gets killed in action, and after that he loses an arm and is brainwashed for realsies this time to be an assassin and more. Not a great time for him. Thankfully, things get a bit better for him these days, even though his endgame goodbye with Old Man Rogers will never not make you shed a tear. Maybe we'll see him again in Captain America 4 or beyond. But overall, you feel good enough about where Bucky Barnes has left off at the end of Falcon and the Winter Soldier. For me, this actually might be the first movie of these Marvel movies where the conflict lives up to the billing. Seeing Captain America constantly huck that shield around, take out a bunch of Hydra goons. So the whole army-on-army fight, giving everyone a moment to shine in the action. The whole Howling Commandos, Tommy Lee Jones, Haley Atwell, who is a certified badass here. The action is frantic and harkens back to the best parts of the Clone Wars films and show. And while we don't see Captain America kill a lot of people overall, we expect him to be saving everyone and the poster boy for justice. In the lead up to the final conflict, he knife throws a guy, sends multiple people out of an airlock with seemingly no parachutes. And of course, while this isn't his fault, directly, one of the most gory MCU moments is we see a guy get propeller bladed and his blood splatter and all that. I mean, I like my darker moments in my Marvel products, if possible. That reminds me of I think it was Fear the Walking Dead. There's a guy who propeller blades his own head after getting bit by a zombie. I always will think of those two scenes back to back. And we know Captain America's our star-spangled man and better than John Walker. But he got up to some stuff too, don't forget. Also, small foreshadowing moment. When Red Skull says he has seen the future with no flags, it's tough to not think of that eventual same plotline being used deep in the MCU with Endgame and eventually Falcon and the Winter Soldier. This may be partially coincidental. Even if it is, it looks now like an awesome payoff. And thankfully this movie decides not to kill off its villain. It may look a certain way at first, but it's always felt more like sending him off somewhere than actually killing him. Thankfully we're able to see this character once again, not Hugo Weaving, but still that brief moment in Infinity War and Endgame. Nice continuity touch points, and once again, it made the whole franchise and those last two movies really encompass the whole arc overall. This, of course, leads to the troubling and heartbreaking end to a potential relationship for Peggy and Steve, and this infamous dance that will never be. While it's a fun action-packed romp, there are some profound emotions here, and this movie is all the better for it. And the modern bring back from the tension to the massive culture shock, and of course, Samuel L. Jackson being in there. It's a bit of a downer ending to a very personal story, but I love it, each and every moment of this Marvel masterclass movie. So the big team-up, Avengers 2012. I don't know if there was anything like this prior. Big movies existed, of course, but bringing in so many superhero characters together while building to something amazing like this. Nothing could have ever come close to what the Avengers did in 2012. And yes, this deep connected world also means we needed to watch each and every movie and connected TV show to get the full gist of the overarching plot. At this point, all the actors are pretty much known. All the Avengers, our main villain, a ton of S.H.I.E.L.D. members. Really, the only new person here is Kobe Smulders as Maria Hill, a character who would be as much the face of S.H.I.E.L.D. as Nick Fury and Agent Coulson. The beginning of this movie, and overall, is loaded with action and gunplay. Tom Hiddleston is back and as charming as ever, and his hybrid Kubrick stare Terminator entrance is pretty nice entrance, to be sure. And while there is only so much, thankfully we get some clear action moments with Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye immediately, the least developed character of the Avengers group leading up to Avengers. And they already made him a baddie. Not a baddie, but a bad fellow. But I will take the action introduction. This movie also gives Samuel L. Jackson way more to do action-wise. His talking and looking cool is one thing, but overall, I'm all about seeing him do some real active stuff. While all the character intros are good, Black Widow, Tony, Captain America, I think it's Bruce Banner that I like the best. It was always going to be something with the recast of one of the 6 titular leads, but overall, it kind of tracks where we pick up him existing. While the Ed Norton version was very much a loner, it doesn't feel so out of left field that he would use his abilities to help people and still live off the radar to avoid those same folks who've been trying to get him. I'm a bit surprised when he comes back all willy-nilly, and I get it would be tough to shoehorn the General hunting him down in this movie, and while General Ross is back in Civil War, he never really comes face-to-face with Hulk again, which is something we clearly are missing out on. But it might be too late, and it might not matter anymore. And then, look, they can always throw even more things into She-Hulk. If there is one intro that missed the mark a little bit for me, and I'm only saying this purely because the deleted scene exists and was shown, much like the arcade scene in X-Men Apocalypse, something that would have added so much to the movie in just 3 minutes. This deleted scene has not only the amazing quote of knocking the Axis on their backsis, but has some great ties to old war footage Steve, his crippling loneliness, and how out of touch he is with the world before we start. His character will always have an air of sadness, and that is great counterpoint to his bountiful rah-rah attitude. But he's so complex in this moment, and not including this scene was a terrible choice. Something that's kind of funny to think about when you think of Phase 1 as a whole. Coulson doesn't actually have all that much screen time in the first only 6 movies. I mean, he was at a brief moment in Captain Marvel, but that was more of a fun callback than a real existing of the character. I just think overall, he's a staple of Phase 1. When I think of Phase 1, I always will think of him, as much as Loki or Nick Fury or Iron Man. I know he never really does all that much in any of the first 5 films, and he doesn't even do all that much here. His big moment is at least a good semi-send-off to the ABC TV show world, something which somehow the movies never did address, and I don't know how they would have found a way to be like, hey, just kidding, I'm alive, check that out. I mean, I'm sure those characters would have liked to know he was alive. They really did go their own separate way quickly after this show was doing their post-Winter Soldier shield fall down, breakdown moment. They got to a point where they were never going to be able to stay interconnected, and they're doing time travel, space travel, all this crazy stuff. Without a doubt, some of the coolest visuals in Phase 1 for sure exist in this movie. And our first look at the helicarrier emerging from the water and seeing the beauty and majesty. It's like our first look at Jurassic Park. It was something that just shows how big this movie is and was at the time and still is now. Honestly, the set piece moments range from large to small, actions and explosion, Hawkeye getting some sniping arrow scenes. And even as a villain, I like seeing him do something. But in that first kind of, I guess I'll call it an action villain scene, our first introduction to what Loki is really up to once he has the cube, there's always something that's a little off with eyeball scenes. It's a little unsettling what Loki does, and like taking a device to take his eye and scan it, and it's always a weird thing to me. Like anything where someone's sticking needles in eyes, just eyes being involved, it's always a bit odd and unnerving to me. Not my biggest movie no, but I just never like it. I don't know why. But the first fight scene we got there, and finding a way to slowly bring all our members into the fray. You know, eventually you got Steve fighting Loki. You got Iron Man coming into the fray. Eventually Thor's back in the mix. You know, maybe it would have been nice to have a little more Thor to start. It would have helped explain how he got back to Earth, which seemingly was impossible to start this movie knowing what happened at the end of Thor. But I do like seeing that first Captain America fight with Loki. It's something that I feel like we don't really see those characters interact a whole lot. And it's nice to kind of see the super soldier fight a mythical being instead of more super soldier, which is kind of his MO and his mostly character tracking arc. And the conflict of our heroes fighting each other, of course, works here. Saying that Scepter makes them more agitated, they just mostly don't have to play together. And that's fine, you know, and this all sets the seeds of Civil War and beyond. Even if the Marvel versions are a bit sanitized and less violent than their portrayals of those storylines in comics, where they're much, much darker. But they have a lot more characters to kill off, and they also bring characters back willy-nilly. So, pros and cons. I don't want to talk too much about the bad version of the Justice League, but you can see some similar parallels with the team's interaction and the weird overuse of dumb jokes in that movie. It exists here. It just pisses me off more there, and looking at it now here, I get a little annoyed. And it's no fault to the Avengers, it's just seeing the better version of Justice League and what that gave us. It grinds my gears a little bit. In the Justice League, they find a way to make Bruce Wayne this angrier Iron Man who stirs up shit just because. In the Snyder Cut, his portrayal as Nick Fury-like character works so much better. And like I said, those bits work in Avengers. Thank goodness we got the true Justice League movie eventually. That'll be available for hard disk purchase, hopefully, come the end of 2021. Honestly, while I obviously like this movie, and it still holds up and gives that same excitement, some of these jokes, probably because of the Snyder Cut thing, they fall a bit flat here, and they're a bit groan-worthy. This might be the first movie of these 6 I noticed, and to be fair, it's the only one of those Phase 1 movies that Whedon directed. And I don't want to get too deep into all that stuff. This movie is a good movie, no doubt about it, and it kicks off arcs for many characters and the greater MCU as a whole. From our first interaction with Cap in modern times, we all know something was a bit off, and his journey to being demystified by rah-rah patriotism and seeing where that led to in Infinity Wars and Endgame. It's a nice payoff, while the infighting leads to some fun conflicts on the ship, and of course, our first look at the Hulk, something we have waited to see for ages since that 2008 movie, which felt like ages ago to this. Especially with that really feeling like it didn't belong in the rest of the MCU. In that conflict, which once again looks amazing, a surprising amount of people can somehow breathe in the thin air from up top on this floating monstrosity, which seemed to be a problematic thing earlier in the movie, especially because some characters need the masks and apparently some don't. I'm a bit surprised from a continuity standpoint. While I'm saying a few downer parts, the first Hulk-Thor battle is great and serves as an early teaser to Thor Ragnarok and their budding rivalry and friendship, seen once again in Age of Ultron. And it is nice seeing some of the fight moments from both Nick Fury and eventually the brief fight scene of Black Widow and Hawkeye. Gosh, we need them together in her solo movie, even for a brief moment. And if there's one part of this movie I remember, the most iconic part, besides that team-up shot in the Big Apple, it's the Coulson gun monologue to Loki. His death is so sudden, and I remember being devastated seeing it at first. And yes, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. helped soften the blow a bit, but that moment made you dislike the fun, charismatic Loki way more than anything else he could have ever done. Honestly, the pacing here is pretty great overall, and Tony's monologue with Loki is iconic and a great kickoff to a visually stunning battle, the overall battle, like you have now come to expect from Marvel, has feature moments with all of our heroes, including some nice team-up moments. Sure, the dialogue is a bit much at times, but other times it's really nice. The I Am God monologue to Hulk fight is inherently amazing and always will be. Overall, I really like this movie. It's tough to argue or fault a lot of this movie. The action and clear direction it takes the MCU is super important, and the setup teaser to that future conflict and growth is a blast. And it's a great send-off and kickoff to Phase 2. But now let's get to some list action. There might be a surprise or two in store for you. Remember, this is just the Phase 1 list. The overall list will come at the end of these 4 episodes. Maybe I'll wait till Black Widow comes out too. I feel like that kind of makes the most sense in all honesty, but Phase 1 list, here we go. Number 6, Sam Rockwell did all he could for this movie, but I think you have to put Iron Man 2 at the bottom of Phase 1. It's just a little too inconsistent. I like this movie, like most of the movies that Marvel has put out, if not all of them. Thor Dark World, we'll see. But it always will feel like one of the weaker entries. Number 5, I like Tim Roth in a lot of things. I like a lot of the moments that exist in Hulk. But the third final act and the third conflict between the two green monsters is just a little too generic for me. And it is hurt a little bit by the fact that the Hulk character, the main actor, is different in this movie. Number 4, gave it a Thor. I like Thor. There's nothing really wrong with it. It just, there's a lot of good MCU movies and it really takes a while to get into it. And there are some amazing actors. Tom Hiddleston is phenomenal in the role. Chris Hemsworth is great in the role. And a lot of smaller role actors do great things in this movie. It's just comparing it to some amazing competition. Top 3, number 3, gave it to the first Iron Man, which you think would be higher. But there's a great notion that this first movie that came all the way back in 2008 still stands a test of time and is amazing in its own right. Got to give a lot of love to Iron Man, the movie that started off and still holds up even as its own individual movie. 2 and 1. It's so close between the Avengers and Captain America. It's way, way closer than anyone would think. Oh man, this is crazy to think about. I don't know if Captain America has the same critical love as I have for it. I know the Avengers does. I think, as much as I love the Avengers, I really, really love Captain America. If I'm going to rewatch one of these movies on bulk, it'll probably be Captain America. So I'm going to give it to the Avengers for number 2, and I'm going to give Captain America number 1. That might sound crazy to you guys, but some of the dialogue is so goofy in the Avengers, and while the action is awesome, I love a good war story. I really do, and Chris Evans and Haley Atwell and Sebastian Stan, there's so many good parts to Captain America, and as a whole movie by itself, it's so good, and I mean, that's it for me, and who knows, honestly, if the Avengers had that really good World War II Captain America intro deleted scene in it, maybe that would have helped it get up a little bit. If there wasn't as much crazy Joss Whedon, Snyder Cut stuff, maybe it wouldn't bug me as much. I don't know, but as it stands, we'll give Captain America the number 1, and I don't feel bad about that in the slightest, but really close there. Well, that is Phase 1. This was a long enough episode, so I will make this wrap brief. What is your favorite Phase 1 movie? How did I do on my list? Let me know if you would have put Avengers high, Captain America low, or flipped and reversed the order. Who knows? Hit me up on social at either knickknackmovies or knickknack_IC, Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok. That's all for me. So cheers, and until next time, cinephiles. Are you not entertained? I think this is gonna be the beginning of a beautiful friendship. I don't like goodbyes. Let's just call this see you later, alligator.